Hello, BCC members and friends. Here we are again, back on our screens. It seems like the whole pandemic is taking us 2 steps forward, 1 step backward, one to the side, to the other side, another one forward. I guess we could call it the pandemic shuffle that we're all involved with. But I do commend and thank the leadership team for their willingness to make a hard decision about canceling worship today. I support them completely, and I know that they are making their very, very best effort to keep the church safe and people with whom we come in contact safe as well. The lectionary today had us listening to the book of Revelation. Now, for some people, Revelation is kind of a weird book. It's kind of unsettling in some ways. I know I do want to preach on it sometime because there's some beautiful stuff there, but these times are already just a little bit weird, and preaching to you on a telephone is a little bit weird, and things are a little unsettling, and I thought, well, we don't need that right now. So instead, I remembered another story from the Gospel of Mark that seems to have some connection to the times we're in. So let us now listen together as Fee reads us this story.
Today's reading comes from the first chapter of Mark, verses 40 to 45. A man suffering from a virulent skin disease came to him and pleaded on his knees, saying, "If you are willing, you can cleanse me." Feeling sorry for him, Jesus stretched out his hand, touched him, and said to him, "I am willing, be cleansed." And at once the skin disease left him, and he was cleansed. And at once Jesus sternly sent him away and said to him, "Mind, you tell no one anything, but go and show yourself to the priest and make the offering for your cleansing prescribed by Moses as evidence to them." The man went away, but then started freely proclaiming and telling the story everywhere, so that Jesus could no longer go openly into any town, but stayed outside in deserted places. Even so, people from all around kept coming to him.
How many of you remember quarantines? I was thinking about them when I was in the midst of my 5-day isolation after having tested positive for COVID. Quarantine was what happened to a household in which, and it was not that long ago either that we did this as a nation, but if one of the children in the household was diagnosed with measles or chickenpox or whooping cough or maybe scarlet fever, when they were diagnosed with that, word would be sent to the public health officials, and then somebody would come and knock on your door and confer with your mother for a little bit, and then take out a little hammer and some tacks and nail a large white sign that said quarantine to your doorpost. Or maybe they would tape it inside the window so that everybody passing by could see. The sign announced to the world that someone in this house was not only very sick, but was also a danger to others in the community. The sign was there to warn people to stay away, and it pretty much worked for that. Thankfully, those diseases are no longer a big part of the American landscape. Lucky us, because the story is vastly different in many developing countries where infant mortality is so high that if it were to happen in our country, we would never put up with it. But today, what I'd like to focus on strictly is the idea of quarantine as a concept, a cultural response to a perceived danger. Quarantine could be inconvenient to say the least. Although I do remember one elementary school friend saying, "It's really not so bad at all. I stay home all day. I get ginger ale and chicken noodle soup while my friends are at school doing long division and diagramming sentences." That was a breeze for him. But it wasn't always so, and it still isn't. One of the more harsh forms of social control is found in all places in the Amish church. It is called the ban. A person who breaks a rule or breaks the covenant with the community is shunned or banned. Old friends simply act as if you're not there. Spouses and family are expected to do the same thing. No talking, no touching. You go through the motions of your life, but the people you love most, they act as if you no longer even existed. In the Middle Ages, during dreadful times of the plague, quarantine was tried as a desperate measure to protect the community from infection. plague victims, and even those who were suspected of being infected were placed in a house together, and then the house was boarded up and sealed shut, and food and water were pushed through a space in the window. In the Palestine of Jesus' day, the disease most dreaded and least understood was called leprosy. Its modern name is Hansen's disease. In its advanced stages, it is disfiguring and so very, very frightening. About the only thing society knew to do with people who had leprosy was to get them away from the community as fast and as far as they could, quarantine them. And thus came about leper colonies, which still exist today in some places. So in Jesus' day, the community response was to separate the individual, to cast him or her out to live alone with other sufferers perhaps, but someplace away from the community. They lived in caves, for instance, and sometimes in empty tombs, which was actually particularly appropriate in some ways, because if you had leprosy, you were virtually dead. The Levitical law prescribed that you wear torn clothing and you let your hair hang all loose in order to warn others away. And then if you saw someone coming and began to encounter them, you were supposed to start to put your hand over your lip and start to say, unclean, unclean. That, by the way, is what you were considered to be in both religious and in civil law. It's all there in the 13th and 14th chapters of Leviticus. It's called Israel's Holiness Code or Purity Code, and it makes fascinating reading. It spells out how all of life is arranged around the concept of clean and unclean. Some of it makes a great deal of sense in terms of health and hygiene. Some of it does not, though. Often it seems that all something needs to be is different in order to be designated unclean. I think that is still with us. The worst part about it was the isolation. One day you're alive, living in your community, in your home, with your neighbor and your family, doing what you do. And the next day you're alone, out in the countryside, hoping that your family may maybe remember to leave some food out somewhere for you to get without coming close to them. You are totally isolated. If by chance someone happens to accidentally touch you, well, that person then becomes unclean as well. So, no more touching, no more holding the hand of your beloved, your wife or husband, your son, your daughter, your babies. No more pats on cheeks, no more gentle caresses, no more embraces. In a very real way, you're dead. And so one of the most dramatic moments in the life of Jesus of Nazareth happens at the very beginning of the story, when one day a man with leprosy does something entirely inappropriate and altogether illegal as well. And he approaches Jesus and speaks across the terrible isolation of the quarantine and begs for help. If you choose, he says, you can make me clean. Moved with pity, Mark reports, Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him and said, I do choose. Be made clean. I suppose it's because over the years I've known so many people who live in a kind of a quarantined existence, even without the disease, a personal isolation, sometimes imposed by others, but as often as not, that isolation can be self-imposed. I think of people isolated by guilt over something they've done, or isolated by anger at someone who hurt or betrayed them, isolated from the community that disappointed them, the institution that failed them, isolated by feelings of inadequacy and inferiority taught in childhood and reinforced over the years by unsatisfactory and failed relationships with employers and friends and spouses and lovers. I suppose it's because I've known so many, and that the isolation and loneliness they've felt is probably no stranger to most of us. I dare say you've had your moments. But because of that, I guess, that this single sentence has become so powerful, so profound, beautiful, I think, almost beyond description. Moved with pity, Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him. Reached across 1,000 years of religiously enforced isolation and quarantine, and in that physical touch, brought the man back into the community, back to his humanity, back to his loved ones. Did you notice the sequence, by the way? Jesus doesn't heal him and then touch him. He touches the man with leprosy. He takes into himself the man's condition and isolation. And in that touch, the man who still has his leprosy is made clean. Even with your leprosy, you are clean, he seems to say. And the revolutionary effect of that is that Jesus presumes to restore the human community and restore to that community a man that the religious authorities said was unclean, unfit, unworthy. If you read the footnotes at the bottom of your Bible, which students of the Bible are often taught to do, you'll discover that pity, moved with pity is perhaps not what moved Jesus to touch this man. Historians and scholars are always discovering ancient texts, some of them older than the texts that we use to translate our versions of the Bible. And some of those ancient texts say it wasn't pity at all that moved Jesus. It was anger. Moved with anger, he stretched out his hand and touched him. Some of the ancient texts say, but isn't that interesting? Anger at whom? Anger at the man for having leprosy? Obviously not. I think it was anger at religion, at the whole system. Anger that all religion could think to do with this man was to exclude him, to condemn him to live outside the community, to divide the human race between the chosen and the unchosen, the clean and the unclean, the holy and the profane, the good and the evil, people like me, people not like me. I think Jesus was angry at a religion that marginalized and rejected the different, the outsiders, the sick, the challenged. A religion that somehow concludes that its role is to build protective walls around the righteous and then to condemn the rest. So, I think it might have just been anger that moved Jesus. It might have been his urgent hope also that whatever followers he had might be people who saw themselves as reconcilers, as restorers, not dividers and excluders. I think that along with the anger, his hope was that his church, his very body on earth, as Paul would come to call it later on, might be known for its hospitality, its welcome, its willingness to open its doors and arms to those who are in any way, for any reason, quarantined by others. I don't think that we should underestimate Jesus' anger at religious people who would diagnose this man as unclean and then quarantine him. I think we're supposed to try to comprehend his hope and his love for that isolated man, a love so amazing, so inclusive, that it could only be the love of God. I think that what Jesus does for the man with leprosy, I think that's the very reason we have the church. Some of you might have seen a movie, it's several years ago now, it's called About Schmidt with Jack Nicholson in it. Schmidt is a recently retired actuary of an Omaha insurance company, and his life work is summarized by a pile of his discarded files on his way to the shredder, a pile he discovers as he visits his old office. He's spent his life predicting the life expectancy of his company's customers, and now he faces his own mortality, and he's alone. His wife has died unexpectedly, leaving him. His daughter lives far away and is engaged to a young man who is simply He doesn't measure up to Schmidt's expectations, that's for sure. He's alone, and in spite of a certain kind of a comedy to his portrayal, he is profoundly lonely. Louis Begley, the author of the book from which the movie was adapted, said that the great theme of the story about Schmidt is Schmidt's, quote, frightful and lifelong loneliness. One day, sorting through his mail, he opens an appeal from an international children's aid fund, which says that for $22 a month, he can help an orphan in Africa, and that he can actually write to that specific child. So he writes the check and starts to correspond with Ngudu, a 6-year-old Tanzanian orphan, and tells the story of his life, his marriage to that young person half a world away. He talks about his marriage, his wife's death, his daughter's wedding. He tells Ngudu about his solitary life. He confesses his loneliness. At the end, after he was returned from the wedding and is sitting alone at his desk, sifting through his mail, he finally names his terrible loneliness, his quarantine. I'm a failure, he says. I never made a difference to a solitary human being. And then he sees an envelope marked Tanzania. In the midst of that terrible loneliness, that lifelong loneliness, that feeling of not mattering to anyone, anytime. But comes this letter. It's from a French nun at the orphanage. She's writing for Ngudu to say thank you for his generous American friend. And there's a wonderful picture Ngudu drew and wanted him to have. The picture Schmidt unfolds is of 2 stick figures, an adult and a child, and their arms are outstretched to each other as if they're holding hands. And for the first time, tears appear on his eyes and run down his cheeks. He stretched out his hand and touched him. Sometimes we isolate and quarantine ourselves. Sometimes it's others who shut us out or who we shut out, leaving ourselves alone. Sometimes we conclude that nobody cares that much about us and that we really matter ultimately to few, if any. And into our loneliness comes one who stretches his hand across all the barriers and empty spaces to touch us and restore us and to give us our lives back again. Jesus Christ is his name. Amen.